40 below zero, weapons jamming across the line, 200 soldiers shivering in the Arctic wind with rifles that won't fire, and one old man, a man they almost didn't let on the bus, pulls a dented ammo can from his rucksack, slides a single hand-loaded cartridge into his rifle, and sends a round downrange that cracks the frozen silence like a thunderclap. The range officer's jaw drops. The battalion commander stops mid-sentence. Every man on that firing line turns to look at the 71-year-old retiree who just did what $100 million worth of modern military ammunition could not. If you believe that experience should never be underestimated, comment respect right now, because this story will remind you why the old ways still matter. Walter Garrett had been loading his own ammunition since 1974. 50 years of measuring powder charges by the tenth of a grain, trimming brass cases to within 1,000th of an inch, and seating bullets with a precision that most factory machines couldn't match. He'd learned the craft from his father, a Korean War armourer who'd watched men die because their weapons failed in the cold. That lesson, that a man's life could depend on how carefully a cartridge was assembled, had shaped every single round Walter ever pressed. In his basement workshop in Fairbanks, Alaska, he kept 7 different reloading presses, a temperature-controlled powder storage cabinet, and logbooks going back to the Carter administration. Each logbook recorded every load he'd ever developed: the powder type, the charge weight, the primer, the case preparation steps, the ambient temperature at the time of firing, and the results. Walter didn't guess. Walter didn't estimate. Walter measured, tested, recorded, and refined. He'd been a competitive shooter for 3 decades, winning regional matches across the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, and he'd served 24 years as a United States Army armourer before retiring as a Chief Warrant Officer 3 in 1998. He knew firearms the way a surgeon knows the human body, not from reading about them, but from spending a lifetime inside them. After retirement, Walter had settled quietly into life in Fairbanks. He ran a small gunsmith shop out of his garage, mostly catering to local hunters and a handful of competitive shooters who knew his reputation. He wasn't flashy, he didn't advertise, he didn't have a website or a social media page. His shop didn't even have a proper sign, just a piece of plywood with Garrett Arms painted in plain white letters, leaning against the mailbox at the end of his gravel driveway. His wife Margaret had passed in 2016, and since then Walter had become even quieter, even more withdrawn. He spent his days at the reloading bench, his evenings reading technical manuals, and his weekends at the range. His neighbours knew him as the old guy with the hearing aids, who waved from the porch but never said much. The younger generation in the shooting community had mostly never heard of him. To them he was just another old-timer. That all changed in February of 2024, when the United States Army's 11th Airborne Division, based at Fort Wainwright near Fairbanks, announced a large-scale Arctic warfare exercise called Operation Frozen Reach. The exercise was designed to test the division's readiness to fight in extreme cold weather environments, and it would involve over 2,000 soldiers conducting live fire training, vehicle operations and survival exercises in temperatures expected to drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The exercise had been planned for months, and it carried significant strategic importance. The Arctic had become a contested theatre, and the Army needed to prove that its forces could operate effectively in conditions that would freeze diesel fuel, shatter plastic components, and turn exposed skin to frostbite in minutes. The Pentagon was watching. Congress was watching. Journalists from every major defense outlet had been embedded with the units. Everything needed to work. It didn't. The problem started on the second day, when Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion moved to the live fire range for their scheduled rifle qualification. The temperature at dawn was -38 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill pushing it past -50. The soldiers had trained for this. They were wearing their extended cold weather clothing systems, their weapons had been cleaned and lubricated with cold weather CLP, and their magazines were loaded with standard issue M855A1 enhanced performance rounds, the Army's frontline 5.56mm ammunition. The first relay of shooters took their positions on the firing line, settled into prone, and began engaging targets at ranges from 50 to 300 metres. Within the first magazine the failures started: bolt overrides, failure to feed, failure to extract, rounds that wouldn't chamber, rounds that chambered but wouldn't fire. The distinctive sound of a firing pin striking a primer and producing nothing but a dead click echoed across the range like a sick drumbeat. Of the 40 soldiers in the first relay, 31 experienced at least one malfunction. 12 of them had weapons that went completely down, unable to fire at all without being cleared by an armourer. The range officer called a halt. The soldiers stood in the biting wind, staring at their weapons with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The armourers went to work. They inspected bolts, replaced extractors, swapped buffer springs, and relubricated everything they could reach. They assumed the malfunctions were weapon-related: dirty chambers, improper lubrication, worn parts. But when the second relay stepped up with freshly inspected weapons and tried again, the same thing happened. Different rifles, same failures. The armourers started looking at each other. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes, the battalion's senior armourer, pulled a round from a magazine, held it up to the light, and frowned. The primer looked fine, the case looked fine, but something was wrong. He chambered the round in his own rifle, aimed downrange, and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. He racked the bolt, ejected the round, and examined it. The primer showed a solid strike. The firing pin had hit it dead centre with proper depth. It simply hadn't ignited. Reyes had been in the army for 14 years, and he'd never seen anything like this. The ammunition was failing, not the weapons. The ammunition. Word travelled fast. By noon, reports were coming in from Charlie Company, Delta Company, and the battalion's weapons platoon. The same failures were happening across the board, across every weapon system that used the M855A1 round. M4 carbines, M249 squad automatic weapons, even the M27 infantry automatic rifles that the attached marine element was carrying, all of them were experiencing unprecedented malfunction rates. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Erickson, convened an emergency meeting in the Tactical Operations Centre. The mood was grim. The ammunition had been drawn from standard supply channels, inspected and stored according to regulations. It had passed all quality control checks, but it wasn't designed for this. The M855A1 round had been developed primarily for performance in temperate and desert environments. Its primer composition, its propellant characteristics, its case specifications, all of it had been optimized for conditions that bore no resemblance to the howling, bone-shattering cold of interior Alaska in February. The ammunition was technically within spec. The spec just wasn't written for -40. Lieutenant Colonel Erickson was a pragmatic officer, and he wasn't the kind of man to let protocol get in the way of solving a problem. He turned to his operations officer, Major Kendra Vasquez, and told her to find anyone in the local area with expertise in cold weather ammunition performance. Vasquez started making calls, to the university, to local law enforcement, to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, to anyone who might have insight into why ammunition behaved differently in extreme cold, and what could be done about it. Within an hour, the same name kept coming up. Walter Garrett. Every local shooter, every hunting guide, every gunsmith in the Fairbanks area said the same thing. If you want to know about making ammunition work in the cold, you talk to Walt Garrett. He's been doing it longer than most of these soldiers have been alive. Major Vasquez found Walter's number through the local gun club and called him that afternoon. Walter listened quietly as she explained the situation. He asked a few short questions: what ammunition lot they were using, what lubricant was on the weapons, what the humidity had been during storage. Then he said in his measured, unhurried way that he thought he could help. He had a batch of hand-loaded 5.56mm rounds in his workshop that he'd developed specifically for sub-zero shooting. He'd been refining the load for years, and it had never failed him, even at -50. He could bring some out to the range the next morning if they wanted. Vasquez hesitated. Bringing civilian ammunition onto a military live-fire range was irregular, to say the least. There were regulations, liability concerns, chain of custody requirements. But she'd heard the desperation in Colonel Erickson's voice, and the exercise was falling apart. She told Walter to be at the main gate at 0600. Walter arrived at Fort Wainwright the next morning in his 2003 Ford F250, the rust on the wheel wells matching the rust on his old metal ammo cans. He was wearing a pair of wool pants that looked like they'd been issued during the Vietnam era, a faded Carhartt jacket patched at both elbows, and a beaver fur hat that his wife had made him in 1992. He moved slowly. His right knee had been replaced twice, and the cold made it ache in ways that no amount of ibuprofen could touch. The guard at the gate looked at him, looked at the visitor's pass Major Vasquez had arranged, and waved him through with an expression that fell somewhere between skepticism and pity. As Walter drove toward the range complex, he passed columns of soldiers in full combat gear, striker vehicles idling with their exhaust turning to instant fog, and supply trucks hauling crates of the same ammunition that had been failing for 2 days straight. He parked his truck near the range control building and stepped out, pulling a battered olive-drab ammo can from the passenger seat. A young specialist walking past glanced at him and muttered something to his buddy. Walter didn't hear it clearly, the hearing aids weren't great in the wind, but the tone was unmistakable. Just another old guy who thinks he knows better. Sergeant First Class Reyes met Walter at the range control building and led him to the firing line where a squad from Bravo Company was waiting. The soldiers were young, most of them in their early 20s, a few barely out of their teens. They looked at Walter the way you'd look at someone's grandfather who'd wandered into the wrong building. A few of them smirked. One private leaned to the soldier next to him and whispered something that made them both laugh. Walter didn't react. He simply set his ammo can on the shooting bench, opened it, and began laying out rows of cartridges with the methodical precision of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. The rounds looked different from the standard issue ammunition. The brass had a slightly different patina, a warm, golden tone that came from careful annealing. The primers were seated flush, each one identical to the last. The overall length of each cartridge was uniform to a degree that the soldiers, even the ones paying attention, probably wouldn't have noticed. But Reyes noticed. He picked up one of Walter's rounds and turned it slowly in his gloved fingers. The neck tension was perfect. The primer pocket was clean. The bullet was seated with a concentricity that spoke of hours of careful die adjustment. Reyes had seen match-grade ammunition before. This was something else. Walter explained in his quiet way what made his loads different. He used a propellant with a burn rate specifically selected for cold weather ignition, a powder that maintained consistent pressure curves even when the ambient temperature dropped well below zero. Most factory ammunition used propellants that were optimized for room temperature performance, and when those powders got extremely cold, their burn characteristics changed. The pressure curve flattened, the ignition delay increased, and in the worst cases the powder simply failed to ignite completely, leaving unburned granules in the barrel and a bullet that either didn't leave the case or exited with insufficient velocity to cycle the action. Walter had tested dozens of powders over the years, at every temperature from 90 degrees above zero to 60 below, and he'd found the ones that worked. He'd matched them with primers that had hotter, more reliable ignition. Primers with a harder cup that resisted the deformation caused by cold, stiffened firing pin springs, and a priming compound that lit off consistently regardless of temperature. He'd prepped his brass with a meticulous process that included full-length resizing, neck turning, flash hole uniforming, and primer pocket uniforming, all done by hand, all checked with gauges, all recorded in his logbooks. Every step was designed to eliminate the variables that could cause a failure. In the cold, there was no margin for error. The chamber dimensions tightened as the steel contracted. The lubricant in the action thickened, slowing the bolt carrier and reducing the force of the firing pin strike. The magazine springs stiffened, altering the feed angle. Every tolerance that was acceptable at room temperature became a potential point of failure at -40. Walter's loads were built to operate within those tightened tolerances. They were, in every meaningful sense, engineered for the cold. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, was not impressed by the explanation. He was 28 years old, a combat veteran with 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and he did not appreciate being told that some retired guy with an ammo can full of homebrew rounds was going to solve a problem that the United States Army's entire logistics apparatus couldn't handle. He looked at Walter with barely concealed impatience and said, with the diplomatic bluntness that NCOs are famous for, that he appreciated the old man coming out, but that his soldiers needed real solutions, not science fair experiments. Walter didn't argue, he didn't bristle. He just nodded and said, quiet as always, that maybe they should try a few rounds and see. The range was cleared for a test. Torres told one of his soldiers, Private First Class Damien Cole, one of the best shots in the platoon, to take a position on the firing line. Cole lay prone behind his M4, magazine loaded with standard M855A1 rounds. The target was a man-sized silhouette at 200 meters. Cole took a breath, let it out halfway and squeezed the trigger. Click. Dead primer. He racked the charging handle, chambered another round and tried again. The rifle fired, but the bolt didn't cycle all the way to the rear. Short stroke. He manually charged the weapon again. The third round fired and cycled, but the fourth was another dead click. Cole cleared the weapon and looked up at Torres with an expression that said everything. Torres's jaw tightened. He'd seen this same pattern for 2 days. Every time they stepped onto the range, the same frustrating, unpredictable string of failures. Walter stepped forward, moving carefully on the packed snow. He held out 5 of his hand-loaded rounds, each one taken from the ammo can with the same deliberate care. Cole looked at Torres. Torres hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Cole loaded the 5 rounds into a fresh magazine, seated it, and charged the weapon. He settled back into position, found the target in his optic, and pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The bolt cycled smoothly, snapping forward with the sharp, clean sound of a weapon operating the way it was supposed to. Brass ejected in a perfect arc. Cole fired again, and again, and again, and again. 5 rounds, 5 clean fires, 5 clean cycles, 0 malfunctions. The brass casings lay in the snow in a neat line, their mouths still trailing wisps of gas in the frozen air. Cole looked up from behind the rifle. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look on his face, surprise, then wonder, then something close to awe, said it all. Torres stared at the brass in the snow. Reyes, standing behind Cole, let out a slow breath. The other soldiers on the line, the ones who'd been watching with detached amusement, were no longer smirking. Torres turned to Walter and said, his voice different now, stripped of the earlier condescension, that he wanted to see it again. Walter nodded and produced more rounds. This time Torres himself took the firing position. He loaded 10 of Walter's rounds and fired them all. 10 for 10. Perfect function. Perfect ignition. He ran the bolt lock to the rear and inspected the chamber. Clean. He looked at the ejected brass. Consistent. He looked at Walter, who was standing in the wind with his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression as calm and unhurried as if he were watching someone shoot paper targets at a Sunday club match. Word reached Lieutenant Colonel Erickson within the hour. He came to the range personally, accompanied by Major Vasquez and the battalion's Command Sergeant Major, a towering man named Command Sergeant Major Roland Drake, who had a reputation for being deeply skeptical of anything that hadn't been issued through proper channels. Drake looked at Walter, looked at the ammo can and said nothing, but his expression conveyed a thorough and comprehensive doubt. Erickson asked for a demonstration. Walter provided more rounds. This time the test was expanded. 3 different weapons, 3 different shooters, 20 rounds each. Every round fired, every round cycled, every weapon functioned flawlessly. Drake watched the entire sequence without moving. When the last round was fired and the last weapon cleared, he walked over to the shooting bench, picked up one of Walter's cartridges and studied it for a long moment. Then he looked at Walter and asked simply, how? Walter explained it again. The powder selection, the primer choice, the brass preparation, the tolerances. He spoke the same way he always spoke, without ego, without showmanship, just laying out the facts the way his logbooks laid out the data. He told them about his father, the Korean War armourer. He told them about the rounds that failed at Chosin. He told them about spending 50 years trying to build ammunition that would never fail a soldier the way that ammunition had failed the men his father served with. He told them that the science wasn't complicated. It was just careful. It was attention to detail. It was understanding that every component of a cartridge was a system, and that system had to be designed for the environment it would operate in. He told them, and his voice never rose above its quiet, steady register, that the cold didn't forgive shortcuts. Drake looked at Erickson. Erickson looked at Vasquez. Vasquez, who had already pulled up Walter's service record on her phone, held it so they could see. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Walter Garrett. 24 years of service, armourer, small arms repair technician, marksmanship instructor, 3 deployments, including one to Norway for a NATO winter warfare exercise in 1987, where he had served as the technical advisor on cold weather weapons maintenance for the entire American contingent. Distinguished Service Medal, Meritorious Service Medal, Army Achievement Medal with 6 oak leaf clusters, National Defense Service Medal, expert qualification in every weapon system the Army issued during his career, and then, in civilian life, 16 state and regional shooting championships, 3 national-level podium finishes in high-power rifle competition, and a lifetime of hand-loading that had produced some of the most consistent ammunition in the competitive shooting world. Walter hadn't mentioned any of it. Not a word. He'd just shown up with his ammo can and his patched jacket and let the rounds speak for themselves. Command Sergeant Major Drake did something then that no one on that range expected. He straightened up, turned to face Walter squarely, and came to attention. A full parade ground position of attention, his heels together, his chin level, his eyes locked on Walter's. Then he saluted. It wasn't a casual salute. It wasn't a perfunctory gesture. It was the kind of salute that career soldiers give to the men they recognize as the real thing. Slow, deliberate, held for a 3 count with a precision that spoke of 30 years of military discipline. Walter, after a moment of visible surprise, returned it. His salute was slower, stiffer. The years had taken their toll, but it was just as precise. He'd learned to salute in 1974, and his body remembered it the way his hands remembered how to seat a primer. The silence on the range was total. The wind had died for a moment, the way it sometimes does in the Arctic, as if even the weather had decided to pay attention. The soldiers, the young ones who had smirked, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had looked at Walter like he was somebody's lost grandpa, they were all staring. Private First Class Cole, still lying behind his rifle, had lifted his head and was watching with an expression that contained the quiet beginning of understanding. Staff Sergeant Torres stood motionless, his earlier skepticism replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. He'd dismissed this man. He'd called his work a science fair experiment. And Walter, instead of taking offence, had simply handed over his ammunition and let the results do the talking. That was the mark of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anybody, because the proof was already loaded into the chamber. Lieutenant Colonel Erickson made a decision on the spot. He wanted Walter to stay on as a technical advisor for the remainder of Operation Frozen Reach. He would need to make some calls. This was irregular, unprecedented even. But the exercise was at stake, and the only ammunition that worked was sitting in an old man's dented ammo can. Walter agreed, on one condition. He wanted access to a workspace where he could demonstrate his loading techniques to the battalion's armourers. He didn't just want to hand over rounds. He wanted to teach them why the rounds worked. He wanted to pass on what his father had taught him, what 50 years at the bench had refined, so that the next time these soldiers faced the cold, they wouldn't be dependent on one old man with a reloading press. Erickson agreed immediately. Over the next 6 days, Walter Garrett became the most important person on Fort Wainwright. The Army flew in a portable reloading setup, and Walter turned a corner of the arms room into a classroom. He taught Sergeant First Class Reyes and his team of armourers everything he knew about cold weather ammunition preparation. He showed them how to select powders based on temperature sensitivity data. He demonstrated proper case preparation, annealing necks to reduce case neck tension in the cold, uniforming flash holes to ensure consistent primer flame propagation, full-length sizing to maintain reliable chambering in thermally contracted chambers. He explained primer selection in terms they could understand. A primer is a tiny bomb, and you need a bomb that goes off when it's cold, not just when it's warm. He showed them how to set up a chronograph test at multiple temperatures, and how to read the velocity spread data to determine whether a load was stable across a thermal range. He made Reyes fire the same load at 3 different temperatures and chart the results. And when Reyes saw that the velocity spread of Walter's load was less than a quarter of what the standard issue ammunition produced, something changed in the younger man's eyes. He wasn't just listening anymore, he was learning. The soldiers noticed too. Word had spread through the battalion, the way it always does in military units, through rumour, exaggeration, and grudging respect. By the 3rd day, soldiers who weren't even in the arms room were finding reasons to walk past and watch Walter work. They'd see this old man, bent over a reloading press with a jeweler's loop on a headband, carefully measuring each powder charge on a scale that he'd been using since 1983, and they'd stop and stare. Some of them asked questions. Walter answered everyone. He never talked down to them. He never made them feel stupid for not knowing. He treated every question like it mattered, because to him, it did. A soldier who understood his ammunition was a soldier who could trust his weapon. And trust, Walter knew, was the difference between pulling the trigger with confidence and pulling it with prayer. Private First Class Cole became something of an unofficial apprentice. He showed up at the arms room every morning before his unit's scheduled training, asking Walter if he could watch, if he could help, if he could try. Walter let him. He started Cole on the basics, cleaning and inspecting brass, measuring case lengths, identifying head stamp markings. Cole was a fast learner, and Walter recognized something in the young man that reminded him of himself at that age. A natural precision, an attention to small things that most people overlooked. By the 4th day, Cole was seating primers under Walter's watchful eye, and by the 5th, he was measuring powder charges. Walter made him check every charge 3 times. Cole didn't complain. He just checked them. Staff Sergeant Torres came to see Walter on the 4th evening. He found the old man alone in the arms room, cleaning his reloading dies with a solvent-soaked brush, his logbook open on the bench beside him. Torres stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked over and sat down on an empty ammo crate. He didn't speak for a while. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than Walter had heard it before. Torres told Walter that he was sorry, that he'd been disrespectful, that he'd looked at Walter and seen an old man who didn't belong, and he'd been wrong. He said he'd been in the army long enough to know that experience mattered more than rank or age, and he'd forgotten it when it counted. Walter set down his brush and looked at Torres for a long moment. Then he said that there was nothing to forgive. He said that he'd been young once too, and that when you're young and strong and carrying a weapon, it's easy to believe that the only thing that matters is what you can see. The things that matter most, Walter said, are usually the things you can't. The grain of powder in the case, the 1,000th of an inch on the brass, the old man who looks like he doesn't belong but has spent his entire life making sure your weapon works when your life depends on it. Torres nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. He reached out and shook Walter's hand, and when he let go, his grip lingered for a moment longer than protocol required. The final day of the live-fire exercise was the culmination of everything. The temperature had dropped to minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest day of the entire operation. The wind was a constant knife, cutting through every layer of clothing and turning exposed metal into a burn hazard. The battalion was scheduled for a full company assault exercise, live ammunition, moving targets, combined arms coordination. It was the centerpiece event of Operation Frozen Reach, the one that the Pentagon observers and the embedded journalists were all there to see. And it was going to be conducted with ammunition that the armourers had prepared under Walter's guidance, using the loading techniques and component selections he'd taught them over the previous 5 days. Not Walter's personal rounds. There weren't enough of those to supply an entire company, but rounds that had been loaded according to his specifications, using primers and powder that Erickson had managed to source through emergency procurement channels that Walter preferred not to ask too many questions about. The company moved to the assault range at first light. 212 soldiers armed and ready, their breath forming instant clouds that the wind tore apart before they could fully form. The range was a mile long, with pop-up targets, trenches, simulated buildings, and obstacles designed to replicate an Arctic combat environment. The observers, a 1-star general from Army Futures Command, a congressional staffer from the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a half-dozen defense journalists, were positioned in a heated observation tower overlooking the range. They had come expecting to document failure. The reports from the first 3 days of the exercise had painted a dire picture. Weapons malfunctioning, soldiers unable to complete basic qualifications, and entire division's cold weather readiness called into question. The observers had their questions ready. The journalists had their critical narratives drafted. This was supposed to be the story of how the army wasn't prepared for the Arctic. The assault began at 07:15. The first platoon advanced from the line of departure, soldiers moving in staggered columns through knee-deep snow, their weapons at the ready. The first targets popped up at 75 meters. The platoon leader gave the command, and the rifles spoke. Not the stuttering, uncertain speech of weapons choking on frozen ammunition, but the crisp, confident crack of rifles firing exactly as designed. Every round ignited, every bolt cycled, every target was engaged. The soldiers moved and shot with the fluid precision of men who trusted their weapons, because for the first time in this exercise they could. The second platoon followed. Same result. Third platoon, same result. Weapons platoon, with their machine guns and grenade launchers. Same result. Walter watched from a position near the range control tower, standing next to Sergeant First Class Reyes. He had his beaver fur hat pulled low against the wind, and his old binoculars, the same pair he'd carried in Norway in 1987, raised to his eyes. He watched the soldiers advance, watched the brass flying, watched the targets falling, and he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the pride of being proven right, not the pride of showing up the younger generation, the pride of a craftsman watching his work fulfill its purpose. Every round that fired cleanly, every weapon that cycled smoothly, every soldier who pulled the trigger and got the result they expected, that was his father's legacy and his life's work, playing out in real time across a frozen battlefield. The one-star general in the observation tower turned to the congressional staffer and said something that the journalist overheard and dutifully recorded. He said that he'd just watched 200 soldiers conduct a flawless live-fire assault in the most extreme conditions the army had tested in a decade, and that the difference between the disaster of the first 3 days and the success he was witnessing right now could be traced to one man, a 71-year-old retired warrant officer who'd driven onto post in a rusted pickup truck with a can of hand-loaded ammunition and 50 years of knowledge that the army had almost forgotten it needed. After the exercise concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Erickson held a formation. The entire battalion, still in their combat gear, still steaming in the cold, assembled in the open area beside the range. Erickson brought Walter forward. He stood in front of those soldiers, hundreds of them, young faces reddened by the wind, body armour dusted with snow, and he introduced Walter. Not as a civilian consultant, not as a technical advisor, as Chief Warrant Officer 3 Walter Garrett, United States Army, retired. A man who had spent 24 years in uniform, and then spent 26 more, making sure that the weapons and ammunition American soldiers carried would work when nothing else would. Erickson's voice carried across the formation with the clarity of a man who meant every word, and when he finished, he did something that broke every convention of a standard military formation. He asked the battalion to render a salute. 200 soldiers snapped to attention. 200 right hands came up in unison, gloved fingers touching the brims of their cold-weather caps, their eyes locked on the old man in the beaver fur hat who stood before them with his patched jacket and his replaced knee, and his hearing aids that didn't work well in the wind. Walter returned the salute. His hand trembled, from the cold, from the emotion, from the years. But he held it. He held it until the command to order arms was given, and even then his hand came down slowly, as if he didn't want the moment to end. That evening, Command Sergeant Major Drake found Walter in the arms room, packing up his reloading equipment. Drake sat down on the same ammo crate that Torres had used and told Walter something that the old man would carry with him for the rest of his life. Drake told him that he'd served in the army for 31 years, and that in all that time he'd met exactly 3 people who truly changed the way he thought about soldiering. His first drill sergeant, who taught him what discipline meant, his first combat commander, who taught him what leadership meant, and Walter Garrett, who taught him that the most important battles are sometimes fought at a loading bench in a basement in Alaska by a man nobody has ever heard of. Drake told Walter that what he'd done wasn't just fixing an ammunition problem. He'd reminded an entire battalion that expertise doesn't have an expiration date, that the old ways aren't old because they are outdated, they're old because they've been proven by time and blood and the unforgiving arithmetic of physics, that a man who has spent his life perfecting a craft doesn't stop being a master, just because his knees hurt and his hearing fades and the world stops paying attention. Walter thanked him. He didn't say much. He never did. But he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small worn leather case. Inside was a single cartridge, a 5.56mm round, brass polished to a warm gold, primer seated perfectly, bullet aligned with the precision of a Swiss watch. It was one of the first rounds Walter had ever loaded back in 1974 under his father's guidance. He'd kept it for 50 years, never fired it, never lost it. He handed it to Drake and told him to give it to whatever young soldier in the battalion showed the most promise. Not the best shot, not the strongest, the one who paid the most attention to the small things, the one who understood that the difference between a weapon that works and a weapon that fails is measured in thousandths of an inch and tenths of a grain. Drake took the cartridge, closed his hand around it, and nodded. The army moved fast after Operation Frozen Reach. Within 6 weeks, an official review was launched into the cold weather performance of standard issue ammunition, with specific attention to primer reliability, propellant temperature sensitivity, and case preparation standards. Walter was invited to consult, and he spent 3 days at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey, sitting in a conference room with ballistic engineers and ordnance officers, his logbook spread across the table, explaining what 50 years of empirical testing had taught him. Some of the engineers bristled. They had doctoral degrees in multi-million-dollar laboratories, and here was a retired warrant officer with handwritten notebooks telling them their ammunition wasn't good enough. But the data didn't lie. Walter's logs showed what their computers confirmed. The standard issue primer compound lost up to 30% of its ignition reliability below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the propellant's pressure curve shifted enough at minus 40 to reduce bolt carrier velocity below the threshold for reliable cycling. Walter had solved both problems with commercially available components and techniques that any trained armourer could learn. The engineers stopped bristling and started listening. 6 months later, the Army issued a technical bulletin updating its cold weather ammunition, storage and preparation procedures with a new section on primer selection criteria for extreme cold weather operations. Walter's name wasn't on the bulletin. These things never carried individual credits. But Reyes, who had been reassigned to the Ordnance School at Fort Lee to develop a new cold weather armourer course, made sure that every student who came through his classroom knew where the material came from. He kept a photograph on his desk. Walter at the reloading bench, jeweler's loop on his headband, hands steady on the press. Under the photograph, handwritten on a piece of masking tape, were the words Walter had said on the range that first morning, when Torres had dismissed his ammunition as a science fair experiment: "The cold doesn't forgive shortcuts." Private First Class Damien Cole, who had been the first soldier to fire Walter's rounds, applied for reclassification to the Armourer Military Occupational Specialty. His application cited his experience during Operation Frozen Reach and his training under Walter Garrett as the reasons for the change. He was accepted. Before he left for his new assignment, he drove to Fairbanks and spent a weekend at Walter's shop, loading ammunition and listening to stories. Walter gave him a reloading press, not a new one, but the one Walter's father had used, the one that had started everything. Cole took it with both hands and a weight in his chest that he couldn't quite name. It was the weight of inheritance, of responsibility, of understanding that some things matter too much to be forgotten. Walter Garrett went back to his quiet life in Fairbanks. He went back to his workshop, his logbooks, his reloading bench. He went back to waving from the porch and not saying much. But something had changed, and it wasn't just the framed letter of commendation from the 11th Airborne Division hanging on his workshop wall, or the occasional phone call from Reyes asking a technical question, or the package that arrived every Christmas from Cole containing a box of brass and a handwritten note updating him on the young man's career. What had changed was subtler than that. The hunters and competitive shooters who came to his shop started bringing their sons and daughters. The local gun club invited him to teach a hand-loading class, and he agreed, and the class filled up in 2 days. A YouTube video that one of the soldiers had taken, just 30 seconds of Cole firing Walter's rounds, the rifle cycling perfectly in the Arctic air while everything else on the range was failing, had somehow found its way onto the internet and accumulated over 2 million views. People drove from Anchorage, from Juneau, from as far as the lower 48, just to meet the old man whose ammunition wouldn't freeze. Walter didn't understand the fuss. He didn't understand why people thought what he did was remarkable. To him, it was just careful work. It was just paying attention. It was just doing the thing that his father had taught him to do, making sure that when a man pulls the trigger, the weapon fires. That's all it had ever been. But in a world that moves fast and builds cheap and replaces things instead of fixing them, maybe careful work is the most remarkable thing of all. Maybe the old man in the patched jacket bending over his reloading press in a cold workshop in Alaska, measuring powder to the 10th of a grain and trimming brass to the 1,000th of an inch, is doing something that the rest of us have forgotten how to value. Maybe the lesson isn't about ammunition. Maybe the lesson is about patience and precision and the quiet, stubborn refusal to cut corners, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody cares, even when the world has decided that you're too old to matter. The cold doesn't forgive shortcuts, neither does life. And the men and women who understand that, the ones who do the work, all of it, every time, no matter how small the detail or how invisible the effort, those are the ones whose rounds will always fire. If this story reminded you that experience, craftsmanship, and quiet dedication are the things that truly matter when everything else fails, then subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of the people who never ask for recognition but deserve every bit of it. Hit that subscribe button leave a comment telling us about a time when the old way turned out to be the right way, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the world needs more people like Walter Garrett. People who do the work, all of it, every time, even when nobody's watching.